We're here this evening to come together, to listen, to reflect, to bear witness and to honour the memory of those murdered in the Holocaust and subsequent genocide. The theme for Holocaust Memorial Day 2024 is the fragility of freedom. Freedom means different things to different people, and today many people take freedoms for granted. And this Holocaust Memorial Day will all reflect on how our freedoms need to be valued. As we reflect on that theme, it's important to note that this year also marks the 30th anniversary of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. The world stood by as Hutu extremists shattered the fragile freedom in Rwanda following decades of tension and violence, and this led to the genocide of over 1 million Tutsis in just 100 days. Today we also have some contemplative and moving community and civic reflections, and we are again really privileged to have worked with the National Holocaust Centre and Museum, who have arranged for Hedi Argent, a Holocaust refugee, to be with us today in Sheffield to tell us about her experiences and reflections of the Holocaust. And Hedi's with us here on the stage, in case you're wondering who my friend to my left is. And after we've had a few more speeches, Hedi will share her reflections, her experiences and her story for all of you. So to begin the programme, I'd like to welcome the Right Worshipful Lord Mayor of Sheffield, Councillor Colin Ross, to give some opening remarks.
Thank you, Kate. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this, our Holocaust Memorial Day Vigil 2024. I would like to reiterate Kate's remarks and to thank the Master Cutler and the Cutlers Company for hosting this event tonight, and indeed for all of you for attending this event as well. Every year at this time, we come together as a city to remember those who suffered under the Nazi persecution during the Holocaust and the subsequent genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Darfur and Bosnia. Holocaust Memorial Day 2024 marks the 30th anniversary of the genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda, and it's 49 years after that was 49 years after the Holocaust ended, and 19 years after the genocide in Cambodia. The world stood by as Hutu extremists shattered the fragile freedoms in Rwanda following decades of tension and violence, and culminating in the murder of over 1 million Tutsis in just 100 days. The theme of Holocaust Memorial Day 2024 is the fragility of freedom, and highlights the ways in which those targeted for persecution will have typically had their freedoms eroded and removed by perpetrator regimes. Today, whilst many people in the Western democracies take freedom for granted, this Holocaust Memorial Day, we can reflect on how these freedoms need to be valued and how also many people around the world face restrictions to their freedoms to live, worship, work, and love freely. On Holocaust Memorial Day 2024, as we come together in communities around the UK, we can all reflect on how freedom is fragile and vulnerable to abuse. Let's pledge not to take our freedoms for granted and consider what we can do to strengthen freedoms around the world. As Kate has said, we're very privileged to be joined by Hedi Argent today. Hedi was born and lived in a suburb of Vienna, Austria, with her parents Max and Lisa. Hedi remembers actually that erosion of freedom, the anti-Jewish laws and the backlash that accompanied Hitler's annexation of Austria in 1938, and the train journey through Europe after the family had left Austria was a very frightening experience. Hedi's family arrived in England in 1939 and first stayed in a safe house in London with other refugees. When war broke out, the family could no longer fulfill the rest of the journey to the United States as the war had prevented further travel. After the war, and the parents found out that most of the other family members in Europe had been murdered during the Holocaust. Hedi has a connection with Sheffield. For a period in the 1940s, her family were located in Sheffield, in Wherledale Road, in fact, and has, through the National Holocaust Centre and the museum, given her testimony, teaching others about her experience during the Holocaust. Her testimony, along with the objects she has donated, provide a crucial role in Holocaust education and will continue to teach people for years to come. This year's theme, the fragility of freedom, also prompts us to consider how ordinary people, such as ourselves, can play a bigger part than we might imagine in challenging prejudices today and strengthen freedom. This dreadful and inhumane period shall never be forgotten, and it's the testimony in others that helps keep that memory alive. Sheffield will continue to raise awareness around the Holocaust and other genocides, encourage solidarity, and act collectively against oppression, and continue to express genuine humanity and kindness to all. Sheffield is the first city of sanctuary in the UK, and we should feel incredibly proud for those of us who call this welcoming and vibrant city our home. We are truly committed in supporting those who have no choice but to flee their homes thousands of miles away to create a life they deserve here with all of us. Together, we move into what is another challenging year ahead, but as we all reflect on how freedom is fragile, let us take the steps together as ordinary but collectively extraordinary people and be the ones that make contributions towards a better world and strengthen freedoms around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. We next have a reflection from the leader of Sheffield City Council, Councillor Tom Hunt.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. As we have heard, the theme for Holocaust Memorial Day 2024 is the fragility of freedom. I want to reflect on that theme in my remarks because regardless of how secure our freedom may feel to us, the events of the Holocaust demonstrate how fragile it truly can be. The Holocaust was the mass murder of 6 million Jewish men, women and children by the Nazi regime and its collaborators in 22 European countries. Jews across Europe in the years prior to the Holocaust experienced increasingly suffocating restrictions to their freedom, where they could travel, who they could associate with, what work they were allowed to do, where they could live. That painful stripping back of their freedoms, that drumbeat of dehumanization, of othering, culminated in the mass murder of the Holocaust. We also saw this in Rwanda. Before the genocide in 1994, there was a long period of othering of the Tutsi population, of propaganda, displacement, and racial discrimination before the killings began. Not only do perpetrator regimes erode the freedom of the people that they are targeting, but they also restrict the freedoms of others around them to prevent challenge. Despite this, there are always those who risk their own freedom to help preserve others' freedom. Brave and righteous people like Abdul Hussein Sadari, who was in charge of the Iranian consular office in Paris in 1942. Sadari issued hundreds of Iranian passports for non-Iranian Jews to save them from persecution. Sadari helped roughly 1,000 Iranian Jewish families escape France, as well as many non-Iranian Jews. Brave and righteous people like Corrie ten Boom, a Dutch watchmaker who lived in Haarlem in the Netherlands, who together with her family hid Jews in their home and helped smuggle them to safety. It is estimated that their family saved around 800 Jews. Those stories and many others feature in a powerful exhibition organised by Seven Hills Shul, which commemorates how Christians and Muslims risked their freedom to save Jews from the Nazis. That exhibition is here this evening, and I hope everybody will be able to take a look. So tonight, as we listen to the speakers, let us all reflect on how freedom is fragile, how vulnerable to abuse it is, and how quickly it can disappear without vigilance. Like the Lord Mayor, I am pleased and humbled that tonight we're joined by Hedi Argent, who will share her testimony shortly. Thank you for joining us this evening and for the vital work that you do to educate us and future generations about the Holocaust. I want to express my sincere thanks to the National Holocaust Museum for their support and partnership with Sheffield City Council to help arrange tonight's civic event. I also want to thank the Council's Equalities team for their work to organise this event, with particular thanks to Bashir Khan. To conclude, let us also reflect on the theme of last year's Holocaust Memorial Day, which, as the Lord Mayor said, was ordinary people. That is all of us. In times of darkness, hope comes from ordinary people taking action to make the world a better place, to protect, uphold, and enhance our freedoms. Hope also comes from educating ourselves about what has happened in the past so that we learn from it. The Italian author and Jewish Holocaust survivor Primo Levi wrote, "We cannot understand fascism, but we can and must understand from where it springs, and we must be on our guard, because what happened can happen again. For this reason, it is everyone's duty to reflect on what happened." So tonight, as we come together to remember the victims of the Holocaust and subsequent genocides, let us renew our commitment in remembrance of the victims who faced unimaginable atrocities. Let us commit to protect the vulnerable, to celebrate difference, and to stand up to injustice and hate. Let us today pledge not to take our freedoms for granted, but reflect on what we can all do as individuals, in whatever role we have, to collectively strengthen the freedom of people here and around the world. Let us commit to learn from the past, to reflect on what has happened and apply that knowledge to our present, and to strive to do all that we can to ensure the future is free from oppression, hatred, racism, and persecution. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hunt. Before we hear from Hedi, I'd like now to invite the South Yorkshire Police and Crime Commissioner, Dr. Alan Billings, to share some further reflections. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I've been asked to say something as the PCC and to say it within 4 minutes. I shall keep to my brief. So briefly then. I looked at the statistics for police recorded hate incidents and hate crimes in South Yorkshire for last year, 2023. These are currently unaudited figures and so not yet in the public domain, so you have to take them with some caution. And they only capture what has been reported, and we know that many people choose not to report. If we want an accurate understanding of what is happening, and we do, then we must encourage people to report, and I assure you will be taken seriously by the police. Last year, there was an overall reduction in hate incidents and hate crime across South Yorkshire. Now that's good. However, within the total, some types of incidents show an increase, including religious incidents, and especially those that were motivated by anti-Semitism. So while there's some reassurance in last year's figures, there are also some very clear warnings. Of course, when the police are involved, that's inevitably after the fact. There's already been a hate incident or a hate crime, and their job is then to enforce the law. So I think we need to think more about prevention rather than enforcement. How do we start to reduce hate incidents, hate crimes? Hatred is a moral failure, but it starts with a failure of imagination, an inability to put yourself in the shoes of others, to see things from their perspective, to feel what they feel. And they then become alien and other. We feel nothing for them, and they are nothing to us. And those resentments and hatreds diminish our humanity, and they wreck our communities. And the opposite is empathy, the ability to make the imaginative leap, to see as others see and feel as others feel. So developing the imagination, this is the key preventative work. But how do you do it? Interestingly, Judaism seeks to do it every year at the annual Passover ceremony. They do it around the Passover meal. The story of the exodus of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt to freedom in the Promised Land. As they recount that, they're doing it. The story of what happened perhaps 3,000 years ago is retold down the generations, partly so that Jews will not take their freedom for granted, but also because it develops their empathy for others. It's a reminder of what it was like being poor and being oppressed then, in order to empathize with those who are poor and oppressed now. Don't pervert the justice due to the foreigner or the fatherless, say the scriptures, for you were once a slave in the land of Egypt. So as I see it, the challenge for us is this. If discrimination begins with hatred, a moral failure, and if it's overcome by developing the imagination, and so our ability to empathize, that's not a police matter. That's a matter for all of us. How do we expand our collective imaginations so as to deepen our capacity to empathize? Well, we tell stories. We tell stories. We have to do that because we can't enforce our way to the peaceable society.
Thank you, Dr. Billings. And that's a really wonderful segue into the part of the evening now where we listen and bear witness to a story, the story of Hedi Argent. And I'm really grateful to both Hedi and Mark Rustling from the National Holocaust Centre and Museum. Where are Mark? Can't see it, there he is. Thank you for honouring us by coming here today and giving us an opportunity to listen and reflect and learn from what you've experienced. Mark, do you want to come up and introduce Hedi? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am not here to reflect, I'm here to introduce my friend Hedi. What Hedi is going to tell us tonight is primarily about freedom being fragile in Germany and Austria in the 1930s and 1940s, but freedom has always been very fragile in this country as well. So I did a bit of Googling this morning. This hall was built in 1932, the year of the Great Reform Act, which gave Sheffield 2 parliamentary constituencies, but Jews and Catholics had to wait another 58 years until they were totally free in Britain, even after this hall was built. So we make a mistake if we see the events of the Holocaust as something that could never happen in this country. And freedom is still fragile here today, and perhaps much more fragile than it was when we met this time last year. A lot of the speakers have mentioned what has happened over the last year, but anti-Jewish hate acts in this country are up 534% in the 2 months after the October the 7th pogrom. And that should give us pause for thought that these acts could never happen again. And what that does, those perpetrators of those acts, is they don't treat people as individuals, they just see the Jew. All the same, just like the Nazis did, and just like all racists do. So at the National Holocaust Museum, we will never use the word, or hyphenated word, anti-Semitism. We will call it what it is, anti-Jewish racism. And Hedi's story, which we're about to hear, features people who treated Hedi as the Jew. They just saw the Jew. But thankfully it also features people who did not see the Jew, they saw Hedi. And they treated her as a human and they saw her humanity. And so really what this event is about today is about allyship. I suspect the vast majority of us here today, including me, are not Jewish. I suspect we're also not Cambodian or Rwandan or Bosnian or Sudanese. But we come together in an event like this to affirm our common humanity. And what Hedi is about to do is nothing more, nothing less than affirming our common humanity. So please give an enormous Sheffield round of applause to my friend Hedi.
I think these wonderful speakers who've come before me have actually said all there is to say. But I've got something left to say. All racism is an attack on our freedom to be different, to be who we are. And Jewish racism, Jewish, anti-Jewish racism, is the oldest racism in the world. It's been doing well for over 2,000 years, and it isn't stopping. The 6 million Jews were murdered during the Holocaust, and the attack on their freedom was complete. But they weren't the only ones. There were also travelers, homosexuals, people who were disabled, and Jehovah's Witnesses. A very mixed bunch. But they were all different. They were all thought to be different. And to be different was to have one's freedom challenged. So, after the Holocaust, I think it's already been said, the countries of the world came together to say, never, never again. But there has been again and again and again the same challenge to freedom. And it happened in Bosnia, in Cambodia, in Darfur, in Rwanda. And today, and during Holocaust Memorial Week, really, the whole week, we commemorate and we honor all those people who were murdered because they were different. And I'm going to tell you a story about 2 children whose fragile freedom was limited because they were Jews. And I am one of those 2 children, but the outcomes for us both were very different. So I'm going to start off with my story. One day, when I was 4 years old, I was out for a walk with my father. And my father was a lawyer. He was a defense lawyer who defended people in court who got into trouble and couldn't always pay very much. So we weren't particularly well off. We were out for a walk, my father and I. It was a lovely day. The sun was shining. We were chatting. And we were on our way home when a man ran up to us, and he was a client of my father's, and he yelled at my father, "I'm not going to pay a dirty Jew." And then he spat at my father, and he ran off. And I cried. And my father comforted me, and he said, "It's all right, Jews are not dirty, but there are people who don't like Jews, and that's anti-Semitism." Now, that was a new word for me, aged 4, anti-Semitism. But I knew what it meant. It meant people didn't like me because I was a Jew. Now, we were an ordinary family. We, as I said, weren't very well off, but we weren't poor. We had a nice home. We lived in Vienna, in Austria. And I suppose you'd say we were content. We had nice food to eat. We had warm clothes in the winter. We didn't need more. We were content. But the adults around me kept talking about this word, anti-Semitism. And that was because the country next to Austria, as you all know, I'm sure, was Germany. One of the 7 countries around Austria. The biggest was Germany. And in Germany, in 1933, when I was 4, and had just been for a walk with my father, Hitler and his Nazi party had come into power. And conditions in Germany were awful. There was huge unemployment, inflation like we can only imagine. A loaf of bread could cost £5, or the equivalent then. And what was happening was that they needed to blame somebody. Somebody had to be blamed for everything that was going on. And Jews have always, throughout history, been a very easy target because they've been a recognizable group of people. And Hitler didn't like Jews anyway to begin with, but he used the conditions in the country and the fact that people were listening to him and wanting a change. Anti-Semitism burgeoned. It just exploded. And Hitler and the Nazi Party were able to make anti-Jewish laws called the Nuremberg Laws, which stopped Jews from going into any public places, having a good education. It made life impossible. And so in Austria, next door to Germany, my parents and their friends were always talking about this anti-Semitism going on in Germany. And they were afraid that what was happening in Germany would happen in Austria because there was already anti-Semitism in Austria. Now, I was an only child, but I had a cousin called Bubi. Now, Bubi is a German word meaning little boy. And we called him little boy even when he was a big boy. And he didn't mind. He was very kind. He was also an only child, and so he was more like a big brother to me than a cousin. We did everything together. Two families went on holiday together. We went ice skating together. We learned to swim together. We used to go and play in the park together. We liked libraries. We liked books. We changed our books regularly together. We had our birthdays together. He was exactly a year older than me, except for one day. His birthday came one day before mine. So for one day every year, he was 2 years older than me, and that was a big joke in the family. And I remember once, for my 8th birthday, I think it was, I got two presents that I really loved, and one was a great big doll, and I called her Susie because that was my favorite name at the time. And I loved this doll because she had great big brown eyes, and I thought she looked so kind. And then my other present that I loved was a gold chain, very fine gold chain with a Star of David on it. Now, I'm sure all of you know that the Star of David is the Jewish symbol, like a cross. It's a Christian symbol. And I loved this chain with a Star of David on it because it was the first piece of jewelry, real jewelry, I'd ever been given. So there we were, enjoying our birthdays, having a good time as children. I suppose you'd call us a happy couple of kids, ordinary. But there was one thing that was not ordinary and was not happy and was not good, and that was school. When I was 6 years old, I started school. That's when one starts in Austria. And on the very first day and the very first moment of going to school, I learnt how anti-Semitism felt as well as what it meant, because I was called a dirty Jew myself. And I was called other names, awful names. Racism always begins with words, bad words used without thought. And so I had to be listening when I was told I was a pig, I was all sorts of things, most of them very, very nasty. And you will see me standing, I will show you, at the back of the class. See where I am? Looking pretty miserable, and I was miserable. I always had to stand at the back of the class because I was a Jew. And I was never included in anything, in any games or any teams, because I was a Jew. And nobody would play with me because I was a Jew. So the anti-Semitism was pretty tough. And then one day something changed. A little girl called Gertie, and you can see her on the photo, I think. There's a white blob on that photo. Can you see that? Well, Gertie's sitting by the white blob. I didn't put the blob there, it just appeared. But there is Gertie. And one day, when I was standing in the playground, just watching what was happening, Gertie came up to me, and she said, "Do you want to play?" And I said, "Yes." So we played, just like that. And then the next day, Gertie came up to me, and she said, "Do you want to play?" And I said, "Yes." And we played. And then we played every day. And after a bit, Gertie started coming to my home to play. And Gertie became my very first real friend. And one day I said to Gertie, "How come you play with me? Don't you know that I'm a Jew?" And Gertie said, "I don't care what you are as long as you're kind. My mum says I've got to do what's right. My mum says I don't have to do what everybody else is doing. My mum says I have to think about things myself. And if I want to play with you, I will play with you." Now, I don't know what any of you think, but I have always thought that Gertie and her mum were two of the bravest people I've ever met, because it takes a lot to stand up for what you think is right. It's much easier just to look the other way, just to pretend it's not happening, nothing to do with you. But Gertie and her mum didn't do that. And then Gertie had to pay the price as well, because nobody would play with her and they started to call her names like Jew lover. But there was something that used to go on at school, in primary school in Austria, every year, 10 days or so before Christmas. And that was when somebody called St. Nicholas would come into the school. Now, St. Nicholas is the equivalent of Santa Claus in England. I mean, he wears a red cloak and a white beard, and he comes into primary schools every year to give all the children who've been good all year a little tiny present. And he carries the presents in a sack over his shoulder. And on his other shoulder, he carries a birch rod to whip all the children who've been bad all year. And he used to come into the classroom and he'd put his sack down on the teacher's desk and open it up. And he had the register. So he would call out all the names of the children who'd been good all year. And he'd give them each a little present. And then he'd say, and now for all the children who've been bad all year. And there was only me left, because I was the only Jewish child in the class. And he'd get down his birch rod, and he'd lift it up, and bring it down, but he'd never really hurt me. But he would pretend to hurt me, and that made all the other children laugh. And worst of all, it made the teachers laugh. So I'm sure I don't have to tell you that life for, by that time, an 8.5-year-old Jewish child was not easy. I hated going to school. I loved the work, but I hated going to school. And then something happened that made everything worse. And that was something called the Anschluss. It's already been mentioned today. And that was when Austria willingly joined Germany to become part of what Hitler wanted to be known as the Third Reich, or a German word meaning the Third Empire. And of course, Hitler hoped that he would be building an empire stronger and larger even than the Roman Empire had been. And Austria willingly joined to become part of the Third Reich. And all those Nuremberg laws that had been passed in Germany over many years, or over 5 years, all those laws became law overnight in Austria. Just right overnight, all the Nuremberg laws became law in Austria. And the very next day after the Anschluss, when my mother took me to school, the headmistress was standing in front of the gates. And as she saw me coming up, she said, in a very loud voice so that everybody could hear all the way around, "Go away, you're expelled. We don't want Jewish children in our school anymore." And there was nothing my mother could do because it had become the law. And by the end of the first week after the Anschluss, a Nazi lawyer came to my father's office and said, "Out, this is my office now." And there was nothing my father could do because it had become the law. And by the end of the first month after the Anschluss, a Nazi family came to our home and said, "This is our home now. You've got a week to get out." And that's what happened. There was nothing my parents could do because it had become the law. And so we were homeless, and my dad was without a job, and I was out of school. And from then on, we kind of lived wherever we could. Somebody would offer us a home for a week or a month, sometimes just a weekend. And that's how we had to live. And then there were other laws. We were no longer allowed to go swimming, ice skating, use a library, go to a cinema or a theatre. We weren't even allowed, Bubi and I, to go and play in the park. And in fact, Jews were not allowed to sit on park benches. So I'm sure you can imagine that life became pretty scary because we never knew what would happen next. And one thing that happened pretty soon afterwards was that we had to register. Wherever we were, we had to register for, even if it was only for a weekend, we had to register with the police. And that was why, because the SA, which were the brown shirts, which were the thugs of the Nazi regime, used to come in the night, in the middle of the night, into homes where they knew there were Jews, and they would take the men, and sometimes the women too, but mostly the men, out of their beds, in their nightclothes, into the street, and they would make them scrub the pavements and clean the public lavatories, and very often with a toothbrush. Now, how humiliating is that? So, if life gets so challenging, so frightening, what would you want to do? I'm sure you can all think of what you'd want to do. You'd want to go elsewhere, anywhere in the world. And indeed, that's what most of us tried to do. And I know my parents started trying to find another place to go immediately after the Anschluss. But then, as now, the world did not want to take refugees. The French government organized a conference in France called the Evian Conference, where all the countries of the world were invited to come and discuss who could take some of these Jewish refugees from Austria and Germany. And out of all the countries in the world that attended, only one, the smallest country that was there, the Dominican Republic, said that they could take some of these refugees. They couldn't take many. They were a tiny country. So we were all stuck. We couldn't find another country to take us. But then something else happened, and that was called Kristallnacht, the November pogrom, when the Nazis set fire to all the synagogues in Vienna and Germany. And they smashed all the windows of any Jewish properties that were left anywhere, a shop or a factory that was still there, anything that they could find, private home, that they thought there were Jews, they smashed the glass. And it was the most eerie sound I've ever heard. It was, didn't know what it was, but it was this sound. And we went to the window and we saw smoke and flames and this sound, and little by little we discovered what was happening. And it was terrifying. And although it's called Kristallnacht, it was 2 nights. It went on for 48 hours. And it was a terror. And if Jews were found on the street, they were taken away. We didn't know where. At that time, we had no knowledge of camps, but we knew that people were disappearing. So the rest of the world did nothing. They did nothing to stop the terror. They did nothing to try and stop the terror. But many countries, including the UK, opened their doors just a little to let a few of these Jewish refugees in. And my parents were very lucky. They had been trying, I think I said since the Anschluss, to find another country. And after Kristallnacht, they were finally given visas to come to England, the three of us. Now, it wasn't quite as simple as that, because conditions were attached to the visa. One of the conditions was that my parents had to find a British citizen who would put down £50 for each of us and guarantee that I would not be a burden on the state until I was 18. My father managed that. He found an English lawyer who paid that money. And do you know, somebody worked out for me that £3 times £50 is the equivalent now of £3,000. So that was a lot of money to put down, and I'm glad to say that we never used any of it. But we were the lucky ones. We finally got permission to come. Now, there was no problem about getting out. The Nazis wanted to get rid of the Jews. But again, there were certain things we had to do before we could get out. One of them was to hand in all valuables, all jewelry, anything that we had left that the Nazis thought was of any worth at all, we had to hand in. And I had to hand in my little gold chain with the Star of David on it, and that made me very cross, I remember, when I was 9 years old, 9 and a bit. And we had to sign a paper, my parents had to sign a paper to say that they were leaving everything behind willingly. Okay. And we were allowed to take with us one suitcase each, one small suitcase each, the size that you would take into an aeroplane cabin nowadays. We could take one each. Now, what would you put into a suitcase? One suitcase, if you thought you were leaving your home, your country, probably forever. I was allowed to take one book and one toy, and I'm sure you all think I pushed great Susie into a suitcase. Well, I couldn't, of course I couldn't. She was much too big, and she would have been squashed anyway. But Big Susie, my big doll, had another little doll, her own doll, and that was called Little Susie. I called her Little Susie. She's exactly like Big Susie, but I'll show you how little she is. There you are. She's tiny. And, of course, she fitted into my suitcase, so I took her. And she now lives in the museum in Nottingham, Nottinghamshire, in Laxton, which is now the National Holocaust Museum, because I used to bring her to these talks, and she got very fragile, and now she lives in this lovely satin box, so she's retired. I took a book that was really not a very good book at all, and I've still got it, but as a child I thought it was a wonderful book. So, and I must tell you that the museum in Nottingham traced this book, and they now have a copy of it in the museum, so you can see that as well. So there we were off. But there was one more thing we had to do before we could leave, and that was to have our passports renewed. Now, there we are. that's me, aged just 10, which was the age when I left, with my left ear showing. Can you see my left ear is showing? Well, my left ear is showing because the Nazis said that all Jews were criminals. And criminals, when they're arrested by the police and have their mugshots taken, have to have their left ear showing as a means of identification. I don't know if that was true or not. But we had to go and have new photographs taken with our left ear showing. And we also had to take in our passports, and the Nazis needed to stamp in on it a great big red J. It covered the whole of the front. J for Jew. And there was a third thing. We all got new names. I was no longer Hedi, I was Sarah, as were all Jewish women and girls. We had our names taken away. And all Jewish men and boys were called Israel. Now, I think they're very nice names. And I think the whole thing was ridiculous. But it was their final kind of saying, you are nobody. You have no identity. You are a nobody. It's a final attack on our freedom to be who we are. But we were on our way. We really were the lucky ones. We came away from all that horror. And the journey to England was not particularly nice. It took 44 hours. I bet many of you have flown to Vienna in 2 hours now. 44 hours. We went on 3 different trains and on a ship, of course. And each time we changed trains in Germany, which was twice, we had to be searched. From top to bottom, I really mean searched. And I, aged 10, exactly 10, was taken away from my parents and searched on my own. And I can assure you that's one of the most frightening experiences and one of the most dreadful attacks on my freedom that you can imagine. But we got here. We were exhausted. We were bewildered. We didn't know, how would it be? Would we always be refugees? Would we always be outsiders? We didn't know what we were coming to. And when we got to Victoria Station, we got off the train and really, hardly knew what we were doing. And a porter came up to us, came up to my father and said, "Help, help." And my father said, with his thick accent that he never really lost, "No, thank you, no money, no money." And the porter looked at me, and he smiled, and he said, "Oh, never mind, miss, never mind." And he pulled out of his pocket a bright, shiny, 16-sided threepenny bit, which had just been minted. And he gave it to me, and he said, "For luck in England, miss, for luck in England." Now, I've kept the same threepenny bit, no longer shiny, in the same purse that I had when I was 10 years old. And you can see it there. And why did I do that? I mean, it's ridiculous, isn't it? And once when I was speaking to a school, one little boy said, "But, miss, why didn't you spend it?" I didn't spend it. I've never given it away. I've never done anything with it except kept it in this purse. And, I never saw that porter again. I don't know what his name was. No idea. For all I know, he gave bright, shiny threepenny bits to all the Jewish refugees arriving from Austria and Germany. I've no idea. But I do know that it was a small act of kindness that meant so much. It meant welcome, acceptance, freedom, safety, a future, and perhaps even a safe place to call home. It was a small act of kindness that has stayed with me for 85 years. And I just want to tell you about another person who talked a lot about acts of kindness, and that was Nicholas Winton. He was the man who organized the Kindertransport, the rescue of children from Germany and Austria. And he once wrote, "Do not be content to do no wrong. Try each day of your life to do some good." And, I think that's what the porter was doing. He was doing some good. So we were here. We got here. We were safe. And everything was different. Every single thing that you can think of was different. I mean, the weather, the food, the way people talk to each other, not just the language. Of course the language was different, but it was the way people talked, the way people related to each other, the houses people lived in, the clothes people wore. Everything was different. And for my parents, that was very hard. They never really got used to the difference. And they remained refugees all their life. They never went back to Austria. They never set foot in Austria again. They were loyal to this country, and they were grateful. But they remained refugees. They always felt like outsiders. But for me, age 10, it was completely different. I was sent to a small village school where my parents in the same village had become servants. My father became a butler and my mother became a cook in this manor house. And it was a small village in Hertfordshire with a small village school. And I started what would then have been, I don't know what it was called, but it would now be year 6, the last year of primary school. And I thought I'd landed in heaven because everybody played with me, everybody talked to me, everybody was nice to me. I went to birthday parties, I went home to people with tea. I'd never known anything like it. I was so happy. I just loved the English language. I learned it very quickly, and the teachers were wonderful. The teachers were nice to me. The teachers gave me lists of words to learn, and then the next day they'd come and test me and give me more words, and they'd sit me at the front of the class so that I could keep up with everything, and they could keep an eye on me. I couldn't believe that school could be like that. I was so happy, and all I wanted to do was to become an English girl. And there, you see me as near as I've ever got to becoming an English girl. But I started off by telling you that I would tell you the story of 2 children. And the second child was Booby, my cousin Booby. Now, Booby lived with my aunt and uncle, his parents, and with our grandmother. She lived with them. So there were 4 of them. And they had tried as hard as we had to find a place to take them. But they had not been as lucky. They did get permission to come to England, And they almost had all their papers and documents and passports ready when the Second World War broke out, only 6 weeks after we arrived here. And because England and Austria were, of course, at war with each other, the borders were closed, and there was no way that they could get out. So they were truly stuck. And they were first of all sent to a ghetto where my grandmother died. And from there they were sent to Auschwitz. And from Auschwitz, where my aunt was gassed, they were sent, the 2 remaining ones, to Bergen-Belsen, where they became slave laborers. Bubi survived that, and he was sent to Mauthausen, which was another labor camp. And when they arrived in Mauthausen, there was snow on the ground, and the camp was already so full because they were trying to evade the American and British armies that were encroaching further and further. And there was no room even in the crowded camp in Mauthausen for these new people, new laborers, to live. So they had to sleep in the snow in a field outside Mauthausen. And when Bubi could no longer work, he was sent on a death march to another camp called Grunskirchen. And Charlotte, who is herself a second-generation refugee survivor, is going to come up and read to you what the Americans found when they liberated Grunskirchen. Charlotte, would you please do that?
Yes, of course. We entered the first building, which was originally built for 300 prisoners and now housed approximately 3,000. Row upon row of living skeletons, jammed so close together that it was impossible for them to move, even if they could have generated enough strength to do so. The place was crawling with lice. A little girl, doubled up with the pains of starvation, cried pitifully for help. A dead man rotted beside her. An English-speaking Jew from Ohio hummed, "The Yanks are coming," and then burst out crying. Few of those remaining alive could stand on their feet. A rabbi tripped over a dead body as he lifted his face towards heaven. I could not understand what he said, but it was a prayer.
Thank you, Charlotte. My cousin, forever Bubi, was one of those human skeletons. And he died one day after liberation, just 2 months before his 17th birthday. Now, Bubi and his family were 4 of the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. We say 6 million. We've got used to saying 6 million Jews got murdered in the Holocaust. What does 6 million mean? If I were to ask you to stand for 1 minute in honor of each of the 6 million, you would be standing for 11 years and 4 months. That gives us an idea of what 6 million meant. Now, I often give talks to children, and the children sometimes will say to me, "But they were monsters, miss." No, the people who did this weren't monsters. They were ordinary people. They were ordinary people like you and me who'd listened to conspiracy theories, to fake news, to misinformation. And they went on and on listening until they believed it. And times were hard, and the jobs in concentration camps were well paid. So they did it. And the victims, they were ordinary people too. I mean, they just happened to be Jews. They hadn't done anything. And the people who stood by, the people who let it happen, they were ordinary people because they were scared. They could see what was happening, but they were scared it might happen to their families if they said something. They thought they might lose their jobs. Jobs were hard to get. They were ordinary people, also listening to fake news and believing. But there were people. There were people who did not stand by, who were brave, who risked their own lives, who risked their own jobs in order to stand up and be counted, like Gertie. And you'll be pleased to know that Gertie and I got in touch with each other again when we were in our 80s. And last year I went to Vienna to meet her, and there she is, Gertie, and she is reading her own story. So, I'd just like us to finish by thinking of the thousands of people all over the world today who are not safe, who need to find a place of safety, who are persecuted because of who they are. And each one of them might finish up like Booby, or with a bit of luck, like me. The choice is ours. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hedi. That's just incredibly moving, and it's wonderful, and what a privilege to hear that story and your experience. It's a real honour to have you here with us today in Sheffield, and have you back here in Sheffield. We are now going to welcome Professor Jane Ginsburg from the Reformed Jewish Congregation in Sheffield, who will give a reading and reflection. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you very much indeed. I don't really want to speak after what you've said, Hedi. I would much rather go on listening to you. So thank you very much indeed. And thank you to the other people who've spoken, to the people who've spoken before me, because many of the things that I've prepared to say are things that you have said yourselves. You've spoken about the fragility of freedom, so I won't do that. I spoke at the Holocaust Memorial Day event in Barnsley on Friday, and I was asked to read and reflect on a poem by a German theologian, Pastor Martin Niemöller, who lived from 1892 to 1984, and you probably know it well. First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. Now, I am not a communist, but I am a democratic socialist. I'm a member of 2 trade unions, and I am a Jew by birth, upbringing, and practice. And I'm a member of Seven Hills Shul, the Sheffield and District Reform Jewish congregation. Some of you may remember that last year I told the story of the ordinary people who helped save the single survivor of my mother's Polish family when all the rest were murdered in Auschwitz. So when I read Pastor Niemöller's poem, I put myself in the shoes of those who are not socialists, trade unionists or Jews. You talked about walking in other people's shoes. So the me they came for and there was no one left to speak out for, in my mind, refers to the other victims of the Nazi Holocaust. Again, some of these people have been mentioned, but also old people, sick people, those we would now describe as having special needs and mental ill health, Roma and Sinti people, and as we've already heard, people who are LGBTQI. And the me they came for also includes the victims of other genocides in Cambodia, Srebrenica, Darfur, and in particular Rwanda, since this year marks the 30th anniversary of the genocide of the Tutsis. So people who only know Pastor Niemöller from his poem may well think of him as an all-round good guy, but he was actually initially an anti-communist who supported Hitler and only began to oppose him because the Nazis wanted to take over the German Protestant church. And for this, he was imprisoned first in Sachsenhausen and then in Dachau, although his experiences in these concentration camps was nothing to the experiences of his Jewish fellow prisoners. It's true that in 1945 and 1946, he was among the first to admit that churches in Germany hadn't done enough to oppose the Nazi regime and to call on ordinary Germans to accept their responsibility for the Holocaust. It wasn't until 1963, however, that he apologized publicly for having himself held anti-Semitic views and given speeches and sermons describing Jews in explicitly anti-Semitic terms. And he devoted the remainder of his life to penance and reconciliation. And what this can tell us is that change is possible, and a change of heart can lead to actions that will change the hearts of others. I was very moved last week to read a letter published in The Guardian by 3 politicians, Baroness Saida Wassi and Naz Shah, MP, who were both Muslims, and Lena Moran, MP, who was raised as a Christian Palestinian. And this is just part of what they said. We commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day at a time when the fabric of our diverse society feels increasingly fragile. It is a moment to remember the systematic slaughter of 6 million Jewish people for no reason other than who they were. The day is also when we remember the genocides of Cambodia, Rwanda, Srebrenica, and Darfur, and remind us all of where dehumanization, prejudice, and hatred can lead. As we remember these genocides, we need to ensure that we learn their lessons and be ready to act to prevent adding any more to that awful list. It is all the more important that we take this moment to remember the inevitable outcome of indulging hatred and staying silent when others are persecuted for who they are. I want to end with a final reflection. One of my fellow speakers at Barnsley said he thought that while time heals, history never forgets. I would beg to differ. We know from the experiences and testimonies not only of survivors of the Nazi Holocaust, but their children and now grandchildren, that time does not necessarily heal. And it is only too easy for history to forget. That's why it is so important that every year we are reminded and that we remember what happened and that we take the steps needed to make sure that it happens never again. Thank you.
One day, my life, my world was turned upside down. It was in 1994, genocide in Rwanda. During that time, I lost my mom, I lost my 2 brothers, I lost 80 people of my extended families. I want to share one day when I heard from my father that we need to hide. I was 12 years old at that time. My eyes saw what no child should ever see. I saw a child sucking its mother's breast, and the mother was killed. I was devastated. I could not do anything. And I live with that memory always, thinking that I could have done something better to help. My mother was killed on my birthday. I know how to live every day, grieving her death, learning how to blow the candle on my birthday cake, always remembering her and the legacy that she has left with us. One day I was queuing to be killed, and the line was getting shorter and shorter every second. There were only 2 people in front of me when someone shouted that the bank in Kigali, in the capital city, was being broken into. And all these killers ran to go and get the money, and I survived that day. I lived every day thinking, this is the day that my life will go.
For our final reflection before the statement of commitment, I'd like to welcome to the stage the Rabbi Golem from the Sheffield Jewish Orthodox community, who has some music and a reflection for us. Thank you, Rabbi.
Lord Mayor, civic and religious dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Trouble with coming at the end of a long list of speakers, most of what you were going to say has been said already. And unscripted is a thank you to you, Hedi, on your wonderful, wonderful life story. I spent some time in Vienna when I was younger, and I visited Mauthausen because I had 2 uncles who were interred there. And from one of the places where we stayed, which was just above one of the streets going up from the Uberdonner Straße in the Zweite Bezirk, we could still see the ruins of the Schiffschule. The only thing remaining was the platform as you go up to the Ark. By then, I think by now it's been repaired. So a little bit of nostalgia there for me as well. I'd like to take a different angle, if I may. Last Thursday was the Jewish New Year for trees. We celebrate that about now trees start a new cycle of growth. Human beings are analogous to trees, and there's much one can learn from them. A tree has 3 parts. Firstly, the roots, which although they lie hidden beneath the ground, nevertheless spread far and wide and nourish the tree. Strong roots keep a tree well anchored to the ground. Then there's the second part. This is the tree itself, everyone individual and unique in the shape and texture of its trunk, branches, and leaves. And thirdly, there is the fruit, which is the tree's contribution for the benefit of others. And within the fruit are the seeds to create future trees. The roots, say Judaism, represent faith, which although hidden, nourishes a person's growth and keeps him or her grounded when the winds threaten to knock one down. Keep your faith strong and you stay upright. The trunk is compared to the visible part of you, or what makes you individual and unique. No 2 human beings are the same, just like every tree is different. In a godly world, every person has their individual role to play. Therefore, no 2 could ever be the same. We all look different, feel different, and have a different set of life skills and past experiences. Your birthday is the day God said, I cannot manage without you. The fruit is your contribution to the world around you and your influence on others to help them grow. Just as fruit produces seeds, so too we contribute to creating others to become trees of their own. All this is in stark contrast to the Holocaust and other such terrible events, where 6 million Jews, including 1.5 million children, were cruelly murdered. In particular, this year, as mentioned, is 30 years since Rwanda, and we must remember the hundreds of thousands who were wantonly massacred with equal measure. So many potential trees and saplings cut down, many in the prime of their lives. Life itself is fragile, and the freedoms that come with it need to be carefully guarded. Failure to do so can lead one on a path, the end of which is that a life of many decades can be lost in an instant. To keep humanity far away from losing that life, we need to protect the freedoms that nurture and encourage growth and prosperity. These are equally the roots which nourish the flourishing of human society and safeguard the sanctity of humanity. Just like a tree without water and nourishment will fail, so too without freedoms we will extinguish the human spirit, and ultimately we wither. One characteristic that trees have is that we could emulate is that trees are constantly growing. Each year the cycle starts again, come what may, and the tree renews its leaves and fruit and adds another ring to its girth. And that is the purpose of today, to refresh our memories of such terrible events in the hope that we learn not to repeat them, to preserve the memories of the past, to strengthen the fragilities of the future, as in the following song. I'm a very tired, old and worn-out man, and my eyes have long been blind. Most things that people say to me just seem to slip my mind. Oh, but the suffering and the painful times that were in years long gone are still as clear upon my memory as the numbers on my arm. What will become of all the memories? Are they to scatter with the dust in the breeze, or will stand before the world knowing what to say when the very last survivor fades away? When I hold my grandson close to me and his fingers trace the pattern of my tears, he asks me, "Grandpa, tell me, why do you cry? What is it that you feel?" Oh, and I tell him there once was another child who smelled this sweet and felt this warm, but he was taken from before my eyes, and only I will remain to mourn. What will become of all the memories? Are they to scatter with the dust in the breeze? who will stand before the world, knowing what to say when the very last survivor fades away. There is little I can say or do to make things change. Time has a way of passing by so fast. Like a fleeting shadow, no one will recall the faces of the past. What will become of all the memories? Are they to scatter with the dust in the breeze? But one thought gives me comfort, it's all that I have left, for I know that God in heaven won't forget. Won't forget. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Golem. We're coming towards the end of the evening, and I'd like to now welcome up the chaplain to the Lord Mayor of Sheffield, Canon Mike Reeder, who will read the statement of commitment alongside all of us as we reconfirm our commitment, and that will be followed by a minute's silence. Thank you.
Vice, Lord Lieutenant, Lord Mayor, Lady Mayoress, honoured guests. Holocaust Memorial Day was established on the 27th of January 2000, when representatives of 46 countries around the world met in Stockholm to discuss Holocaust education, remembrance and research. At the end of this meeting, all attendees signed a declaration of commitment to preserving the memory of those who were murdered in the Holocaust. We too have met like they have tonight and have been moved to tears. And so we, if you're able, will you stand with me as we make our own commitment in the light of what we've heard today? We say together, we recognize that the Holocaust shook the foundations of modern civilization. Its unprecedented character and horror will always hold universal meaning. We believe the Holocaust must have a permanent place in our nations and communities' collected memory. We honor the survivors still with us and remain our shared goals of mutual understanding and justice. We must make sure the future generation understand the causes of the Holocaust and reflect upon its consequences. We vow to remember the victims of Nazi persecution and all genocides. We value the sacrifices of those who have risked their lives to protect or rescue victims as a touchstone of human capacity for good in the face of evil. We recognize that humanity is still scarred by the belief that race, religion, disability, or sexuality make some people's lives worthless than others. Genocide, anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, and discrimination still continue. We have a shared responsibility to fight these evils. We pledge to strengthen our efforts to promote education and research about the Holocaust and other genocides. We will do our utmost to make sure that the lessons of such events are fully learned. We will continue to encourage the Holocaust remembrance by organising an activity of commemoration of the Holocaust Memorial Day. We commend the evils of prejudice, discrimination, and racism. We value a free, respectful, and democratic society. Please be seated.
We're now going to close the ceremony with some music from Phil Tomlinson and Maya Brown. Just before you leave this evening, we'll also be welcoming people to light a candle after the music. Please note as well that we're hosting the poster display which was launched at the Holocaust Memorial Day concert last week. As has been mentioned, I'd like to thank everyone again who's attended, and especially our guest speakers, most of all Hedi, who've all given us so much to learn from and reflect upon in relation to this year's theme. And I just want to reiterate my personal thanks to everyone on the team who's organised the event, and most especially Bashir Khan, who, as ever, has done an incredible job pulling together this evening's events. Thank you.
Good evening. I've chosen this song, sung at many HMD events, because children are our future. We dedicate this song to all of the innocent children who've died or suffered as a result of conflict. This song is sung in Yiddish, the secular language of the Northern European Jews. The song paints a picture of the emptiness of the places where the dead children are no longer playing. You will hear the names of children echoing through the song. Die polnische Grüninge Beine spüren sich mehr mit kein Mäuschen Schlauch, spüren sich mehr mit kein Sorge Fleisch, nicht auf kein Gräselach, nicht auf kein Schneelach. Surfen schon mehr mit die jüdische Stimme von die Kondis im Motten mit den zerquälten, zerkaputten Zungen von einem Beweisen von deren Unwohlheit. Steuern sind die polnische Bämle, teut seinen jüdischen Himmel und Himmel, teut seinen Gässle, Horeb die Heißle, wo es verstecken sich Kinder wie Meißle, jüdische Kinder mit großen Ekeln, schwarzer Säule mit Reichert verzeugen, Ekeln voll mit Pachen verlaufen, unter der umdrückten Träumen getroffen. Unter die polnische Grüninge Bäume spielen sich mehr nicht kein Mäuschen
Russian